Hello, this is Kyle Matthews, Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're here for another interview for the Coronavirus Diaries, a discussion with experts around the world about human rights in the age of the global pandemic. Today, I'm very lucky to have Jean-Paul Marthoz, a well-respected journalist from Belgium. He writes for Soir. He's also involved with the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's been involved with Human Rights Watch. He's done some really interesting work with UNESCO on reporting regarding terrorism and political violence. Jean-Paul, we had you up here in Montreal about 9 years ago for a conference on the responsibility to protect and journalists, and you also passed through town, I think it was 2 years ago. Time flies by too much, but we're really glad to have you join us today.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here with you.
So, Jean-Paul, maybe just to start with, I'd like to know, I was in South Africa about a month ago, never saw what was coming, come back. Now my friends who are in Cape Town are under lockdown. I had friends that joined me from Rwanda, they're in lockdown, and I'm in Montreal, we're in lockdown. 3 different countries, 3 different places. What's it like right now where you're based in the greater Brussels area?
Well, we have been in confinement in the last 15 days, more or less. I mean, it's rather strict confinement. The question is how, to what extent this confinement is really respected. There are a number of cases of police arresting people because they don't respect those rules, but in general, it seems to be respected. Of course, the situation is that the economy is just dead, in the sense there's not that much activity. People are concerned about the extent of the virus, are concerned about the fact that there are many problems in hospitals. In Belgium, and it's many whatever, a government which has no real majority, and which had to push for special powers in the parliament a couple of days ago to make sure that they had constitutionally the right to impose a number of measures. So it's a fragile situation. Politically, there's a lot of debates and controversies around how the government should tackle the issue, but also as the parties are trying to organize a new government which would have a real basis in the parliament, it confuses perhaps the way you could rationally discuss the issue, because there's always a second agenda behind the health agenda. There's a political agenda. That's a bit special to Belgium, I fear.
Yeah. And Brussels is the capital of Europe, literally. That's where the European Union is headquarters. Has the European Union and all its institutions also, they must also be on lockdown as well. It must be like all governments, not just the Belgian government, Brussels, but also the EU is now effectively working from afar.
Yeah, they apply the same rules as they are based in Belgium. They have to respect the rules that are applicable to anyone living in Belgium. So yes, I mean, the EU is still working. You can see a whole number of initiatives that are being discussed, especially on the economic front, but also trying to organize a common health response to the crisis. But yes, the civil servants within the institutions in Brussels are working mostly online and are locked down like others.
So Jean-Paul, as a journalist, you understand the important work that journalists do of uncovering information, holding governments to account, looking at cases where governments might sweep certain facts under the rug because it might hurt them politically or individuals in government. I'm wondering, what is your take on the coronavirus? I mean, it emerged out of China, and we have stories of citizen journalists who reported from Wuhan who have disappeared, other people who criticize the regime. What is your view on how criticism of any independent voices, journalist or citizen journalist, has led us to this stage? Do you think there's a link there?
Yeah, I think there's. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago concerning censorship and its link with outbreaks and pandemics. And the history shows clearly that censorship is a so-called state or censorship, and what's the direct link between the presence of censorship and the impact of the flu. And so there are a number of cases in the history where you can really make a link between the lack of transparency, the lack of freedom of the press, state censorship, and the impact of a crisis. And I really believe that the fact that in China there was at the beginning so much pressure not to confirm the existence of a specific crisis, specific outbreak in Wuhan, that people were repressed for trying to express their concern, that there was no coverage in the Chinese media of the crisis, that there was no real information given to the international society, apart from the World Health Organization, which kept to some extent the issue under wraps. I think it's certainly one of the reasons why the extent of the crisis became so acute and went abroad to some extent. And so there was a former French ambassador, Michel Duclos, who works with the think tank in Paris, Institut Montaigne, who said the opacity of the Chinese government is part of the reason why we had this delay for 3 weeks, perhaps, in failing to address the crisis. And as Matthew Barron wrote in a letter to the readers of the Washington Post, he mentioned on the 8th of January already, there were articles in the Washington Post, but also there were other articles in international media describing the emergence of a crisis in the region. And so no one can say that there was a transparency on the part of the Chinese government. Of course, now today, the Chinese government pretends that it has transparency, but there's a doubt, which is lurking in all that story. And it's certainly one of the major issues that are, for me, a reason for concern, is that when you address that kind of a pandemic, you definitely need to have transparency. Is it the only way to create trust among the people, and especially in democracy? It's in the sense that if you want to have people ready to stay at home, to respect a number of guidelines, I mean, they have to trust that the government not necessarily says what it's really happening, because there's a lot of unknowns about the virus, but at least that this government is transparent and really does what it should be doing as a government to try to inform correctly its people.
And so that's why I really like the title of your article. The French translation was "When Truth is Quarantined," and I think that poses a real danger about the freedom to information, the freedom of expression, to alert each other, and also when you talk about trust, I think there is a wider issue here of people, a trust towards an authoritarian government like China. How much can we trust a country that's imprisoned a million plus Uyghur Muslims and says it's fake news? We also, when we look at the stats of imprisoned journalists, I believe that China is also one of the highest ones up there, if not has the highest number of journalists. So there's no free state media. So there is a real issue of trust I see here. Jean-Paul, another recent development in all this is that Beijing has recently expelled all American journalists of territory, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times. How serious should we take this? I mean, is this a sign of more authoritarianism, or is it going to be harder for us to know what's really happening in China?
No, I think that China has sent the wrong thing from the beginning, in a sense. First, too much delay in really informing correctly about what was happening, but the gravity of the crisis. But who did a great job, because they were not there to bash China, they were there to inform on a health crisis which had deep local implications and international implication, is the wrong signal. Because definitely, if you don't have this kind of coverage on the ground from independent voices, I mean, it means that you want either to hide something, or some issues will not be highlighted quickly enough and will not be addressed. And so I think it's really a very dangerous game that China is playing by basically refusing access to international correspondence to to the areas where they want to cover the crisis. So yes, and I think that today, I mean, China is trying to some extent to compensate its bad image as a repressor from expression by extolling its virtues, by showing that it's sending masks and medical equipment to a number of countries. But it can't work really, because if you have this kind of constant repression of freedom of expression, you can't really trust what's going on. And I have seen in a number of days, in a couple of days, I mean, after kind of a positive reception by many journalists of the statements by China that everything was going back to normal in the Hubei province, for instance, journalists coming back to their sort of a critical sense and saying, okay, this is what the Chinese government has been telling us, but the Chinese government has not told us the story frankly in the last 2 months. And then they expelled journalists, international journalists. So I think that this is a pretty dangerous game, because what we do need definitely in China, but elsewhere, I mean, not only in China, is to have independent observers, international journalists, NGOs or international organizations, making sure that the right information comes to us. Because if we have those kinds of silent zones or black holes of information, it's not only a question of freedom of expression, which by principle I strongly defend, but it's also a question of health. If you have those kinds of black holes, you don't have all the facts that you need to address a very complex crisis. And the medical establishment is really pushing internationally for I mean, having access to all the facts that you can collect. And journalism is part of this huge team of people who wanted to use information as a way to address medically the crisis, but also politically the crisis.
Jean-Paul, I'm going to ask you just one last question. You touched upon how China has, or the Chinese government and Chinese state media has really gone defensive, trying to rebrand itself as, almost surpassing the United States as an actor, helping states. We've seen some people have called mass diplomacy, where China has been, helping other EU member countries, Spain, the Netherlands, also Serbia with medical supplies. Mm-hmm. And so some of them have been rejected as being, bad quality. But I'm wondering, from your views of this, what is the wider European society? Do they see this as just thank you, China, for helping us, or is there a skepticism that we're partly in this situation because you put us there? And are people buying this mass diplomacy, or they see it as a form of propaganda?
I think there are different forms of reaction. I mean, I've seen everything in this country in relation to this question of mass diplomacy. I mean, some people in the media extolling the help that China is going to give to a number of countries that are deeply affected, and comparing this help with the absence of the European Union, for instance, of the absence of leadership, for instance, of the US. So it's true that some people are sort of saying China is doing the right thing, but I feel there's a high level of skepticism to China, because when you are seen as trying to use that kind of crisis to push your global interest and sort of a national interest around the globe, I mean, I'm not sure that it's really working, because it's a moment when the world should be working together. If you imply by the fact that you are sort of showing your own system of assistance as part of a propaganda, I mean, it can backlash against you. And, a number of embassies, for instance, Chinese embassies, have been sending on Twitter a number of messages that are actually contradictory to a reasoned information policy, by implying, some have implied that the origin of the virus is not in China, but in the US. Others are using their own Twitter feed to criticize the lack of EU response and to show the strengths of the Chinese response in Europe. All this, I mean, I don't think it works it would work on a long-term basis as a basis for propaganda for China. I think it will backlash against China if they do too much around it. I think today there is an expectation, I feel it in reading lots of articles and listening to many interviews, there's a sense that we are all in there together. The UN General Secretary mentioned it very clearly. We're all in the crisis together. And the only decent way of addressing the crisis is really to make sure that everyone is playing the game fairly. And unfortunately, we can see, for instance, around the competition to acquire masks or ventilators, that there's no real sense of solidarity. It's a kind of a free-for-all, a law of the jungle to get those marks. And I think that's pretty much, it is pretty, I mean, it's not really a very nice thing to say and to see. So, yeah, I think that personally, I think that the UN or internationally recognized voice should again insist that this is not the moment to try to settle scores and push for sort of national responses to a crisis which is global and which we don't know how we are going to solve and which might reappear in the next years or so. So we might better try to find a solution on a long-term basis based on multilateralism, on cooperation, and not just on this kind of competition, which shows too much its bad ways of propaganda and sort of a attempt at increasing your own national influence around the globe.
Jean-Paul, I agree with you, everything you said. I think we need a better global response. I think we got to prepare for the long term. And I think you ended with the most important point, that we're fighting with each other, but the end game is trying to keep people healthy.
Absolutely.
That's the ultimate human right. It's to protect human lives. So I just want to thank you for joining us today, and I wish you
for inviting me.
Best of luck in Brussels and continue your work as a journalist.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice day in Montreal. Goodbye. Thanks.